Hi and welcome to Gravitas. My name is Priyanka Sharma. Here's what's coming up tonight on the show. There's a wave of nostalgia sweeping China. The people of China are remembering better times, a time of economic boom. They are remembering a time which was in stark contrast to their current reality. Former Chinese President Jiang Zemin has died. He led the country for a decade of rapid economic growth following the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989, and his death comes at a time when the Chinese economy is struggling. His death comes at a time when China is in the news for all the wrong reasons. China's zero-COVID nightmare continues. Authorities are trying to curb rare dissent on the streets. Residents are fed up with COVID policies, which just don't make any sense anymore. It's a tumultuous time in China. And there is one man to blame, Xi Jinping. From the scenes which are unfolding in China, it is evident that ghosts of the past are coming back to haunt the Chinese regime. The ghosts of Tiananmen. And this is our top focus on Gravitas tonight. Also on the show, we expose Europe's climate hypocrisy. Big polluting industries have been given almost £100 billion in free carbon permits by the European Union. So what right does Europe have to preach about climate action to the world? Iran lost to the USA in the match yesterday, but you'll be shocked to know that Iran's World Cup defeat was met with celebrations in Tehran. Why are Iranians cheering their team's loss? We'll tell you. And in what is being called a momentous breakthrough, a new Alzheimer's drug claims to slow down cognitive decline among patients. Is this really a breakthrough? What are the side effects? We'll discuss. A Chinese leader has died. Mourners have turned protesters. They are demanding freedom. It's a student-led movement, one that China is determined to crush. Does it ring a bell? It is an echo from communist China's worst nightmare, Tiananmen Square. The uprising that gave the Chinese communists a fright just when the Soviet Union was collapsing and communism's survival was in question. Let's rewind to 1989. This is what unfolded in Beijing following the death of Hu Yaobang. He was the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. He was forced to resign back in 1987. 2 years later, Hu died. His funeral sparked the biggest political fire in modern-day China. And then in April of 1989, tens of thousands gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square demanding democratic reform. His funeral sparked the biggest political fire. What happened next? Cut to 2022, and it seems that history is repeating itself. What happened in 1989 is happening again. Not necessarily in the same sequence, but close enough to bring to life the ghost of Tiananmen and haunt China. Earlier today, China's former president, Jiang Zemin, died. He was 96. Jiang was handpicked to save Chinese communism from crumbling after the Tiananmen Square protests, and did so through what can only be described as pro-capitalist reform. His death comes at a time when China is witnessing its biggest protests since Tiananmen. The same cities that saw demonstrations in 1989 have erupted in protests again. Just like in 1989, this time too there is a call for reform. There is a call for free press. Jiang Zemin had presided over China's economic growth. he positioned the country as a major manufacturing power. His death comes at a time when China risks losing the tag, the famous tag of being the world's factory. The country's zero COVID policy is driving out businesses. We've been talking about this on the show. If Jiang brought in an era of economic boom, his death symbolizes the start of this era's end. If Jiang symbolized political stability following Tiananmen, his death marks the start of social disorder and another Tiananmen. We will make our point tonight over the course of this hour. We will start by showing you what's happening in China, why the unprecedented wave of protests and clashes is eerily similar to Tiananmen. We will bring you the story of Jiang Zemin, the communist leader who would quote Lincoln, sing Elvis Presley songs, and endorse Xi Jinping as a strong leader. We will show you how this quote-unquote strong leader is hammering China's economy, how his policies have assaulted Chinese businesses, and now business leaders like Jack Ma. Reports say the Alibaba co-founder is hiding in Japan. And as Xi faces his toughest test, the country's military is busy provoking its neighbors. Earlier today, PLA's warplanes entered South Korea's air defense zones, prompting the latter to scramble jets. We will run you through all of this in our cover story tonight. Let's start by rewinding to 1989, the weeks following the death of Hu Yaobang. Crowds gathered across China. These crowds were mostly led by students. They were demanding reform. In 1989, China saw demonstrations breaking out in Shanghai, Nanjing, Xi'an, Changsha and Chengdu. Guess what? In the last few days, almost all of these cities have seen protests. Just like 1989, this time too, the protests have been mostly led by students. They have been widely broadcast worldwide, and they have been dominated by calls for reform, freedom, free press and free speech. For the first time, China has heard public calls for Xi Jinping's resignation. This is rare. Wide-scale sloganeering. Xi's government has come down heavily on protesters. The police have been asked to go after every demonstrator. People are being stopped in the middle of the road. Their phones are being checked for protest-related content. People are also being detained. Some students have received phone calls from police officers demanding information about their whereabouts. On the weekend, more protests broke out, but none of these have stopped the fever of dissent from spreading. Let me now show you what happened in Guangzhou yesterday. People toppled a COVID-19 testing tent. They threw things at the riot police. One video showed dozens of police clad in hazmat suits advancing towards protesters. Some protesters were seen gathering around barricades, demarcating lockdown zones. What are these protesters demanding? End to zero COVID, sure. But that's just a starting point. These protests have now snowballed into a movement for freedom in a much wider sense. Today, Chinese students are yearning for broader political freedom. Just like they did back in 1989, some of these students say they are excited to be part of this massive movement. Yes, it's a movement. Unlike 1989, Chinese students today are tech savvy. They know how to navigate the Chinese firewall. They are communicating via Telegram, even dating apps. They are sharing protest-related information through cryptic messages. These students know how to lead an uprising, even under the watchful eyes of Beijing. They don't need a statue of the goddess of democracy to convey their message to the leaders sitting in Beijing. Just a blank sheet of paper is enough. Even a mathematical equation, like this one. It was developed by Russian physicist and mathematician Alexander Friedman. His formulas have become a popular symbol of resistance across campuses in China simply because the name, Friedman, well, it sounds a lot like a free man. It's a wordplay that the students are betting on in their call for freedom. Many students of the Hong Kong University decided to risk the security law by continuing to publicly extend their support for their colleagues in the mainland. I repeat, this is rare, it's unheard of. This is China we're talking about. Many of them gathered inside the campus on Tuesday, chanting slogans and holding banners. This one reads, "Release arrested protesters, step down to apologize. We don't want dictatorial leaders. We want elections. We don't want dictatorship, we want democracy." Students say they are not afraid of a crackdown and that people will continue to resist the government in their own unique ways.
Zero COVID policy for freedom. 要自由，不要封口，要自由，不要核酸，要吃饭。
In my opinion, the spirit of resistance is ingrained in the heart of every Chinese citizen. I believe that more and more individuals are becoming awakened and sober.
So what does this mean for Beijing? The Chinese leaders remember Tiananmen only too well. They are aware of the damage that a student-led movement can do. It explains why China has ordered shutting down of several colleges under the pretext of COVID-19. It doesn't make much of a difference at a time when people across China are feeling increasingly connected with the protesters and the sloganeering in universities. Listen in.
Many people are under a lot of pressure. Mortgage, car and many other expenses. They can't bear being in lockdown for too long. I think protesting is reasonable.
Protesting is reasonable, and that's why people across China are coming out to join the mass civil disobedience movement. On Tuesday, residents of Jinan tried to break out of a lockdown. Take a look at this. These protests come despite the CCP's strong warning against dissent. The party's law enforcement agency released this document threatening protesters without even mentioning the word protest. It reads, "Illegal and criminal acts that disrupt social order will not be tolerated." Too bad. The threat clearly did not work. Chinese students are not just protesting within China but also outside. Around 100 people, mostly Chinese students, gathered in Washington to protest against Xi Jinping. One protester held a placard. It read, "Give me liberty or give me death." There have also been protests in New York and Toronto.
We do not only oppose to zero COVID policy, also we oppose to the non-democracy regime. We want to change the regime.
Just how, encouraged I am seeing Chinese people stand up for themselves and how I wish them the best in their fight for freedom and democracy.
This is the first time since Tiananmen that words like freedom and democracy are being uttered so publicly in the context of China. Back then, the Communist Party had sent tanks and troops to crush dissent. China was ostracized following the bloody crackdown. In the months following Tiananmen, a leader named Jiang Zemin rose to power. He became China's president in 1993. Under Jiang, China saw an economic boom. The Communist Party tightened its grip on power. It's almost ironical that Jiang Zemin has died at a time when both the CCP and China's economy are facing a crisis. Jiang was 96 years old. The Chinese Communist Party said the former president died of leukemia and multiple organ failure. Our next report brings you his story.
So, who was Jiang Zemin? The compromise candidate. The hardliner who crushed dissent. The visionary who opened up China to the world. In a way, he was all these things. Jiang Zemin was born on August 17, 1926. In the city of Yangzhou in the Jiangsu province. He was born during the Japanese occupation of China. While in college, he joined the Chinese Communist Party. This is when he was studying to become an electrical engineer. He went on to get trained in Moscow at the Stalin Automobile Works. When he returned to China, he worked at Changchun's first automobile works. After working at the factory, he eventually joined the government services. He rose through the ranks and eventually became a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. In 1983, he was appointed as the Minister of Electronic Industries. In 1985, he became mayor of Shanghai. Then the Communist Party Committee Secretary of Shanghai. During his tenure as Shanghai's mayor, he received mixed reviews. He was called a flower pot. It's a Chinese term for someone who seems useful but gets nothing done. In 1986, there was a challenge to his authority. Students were demonstrating against the lack of political reform. Jiang Zemin stunned protesters by reciting the Gettysburg Address in English. This was the speech the U.S. President Abraham Lincoln had delivered to soldiers fighting the American Civil War. Jiang Zemin managed to stem the protests. Over the years, he took other measures to quell dissent in Shanghai. In May 1989, he shut down the newspaper World Economic Herald. He said it was harmful and fueling the 1989 protests. His actions didn't go unnoticed. After the massacre at Tiananmen Square in 1989, the administration had to do something. Deng Xiaoping was still president at the time. In June, he dismissed the then CCP General Secretary Zhao Xiang. Zhao Xiang was seen as being too sympathetic towards the student protesters. He was replaced by Jiang Zemin. Thus, Jiang Zemin became Deng Xiaoping's successor. It was a compromise, and no one expected him to last long. He was thought of as a transition candidate, but he proved his critics wrong. Jiang Zemin had embraced Deng Xiaoping's economic vision. In 1992, after some prodding by Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin introduced the term socialist market economy. The rest, as they say, is history. China's economic rise began during Jiang Zemin's tenure. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Jiang Zemin even allowed entrepreneurs to join the CCP. A first since the revolution. Jiang Zemin made important political gains too. He oversaw the return of Hong Kong from the UK and Macau from Portugal. He mended ties with the US, famously offering to cooperate on the war against terror after 9/11. But for all his achievements, there was also repression. Jiang Zemin insisted Taiwan was a part of China. Live military drills during his reign soured relations with the island. Jiang Zemin's government put forward their own candidate instead. Economic progress during his tenure helped take the focus away from the lack of political reform in China. It set the path for the situation China faces today. Jiang Zemin handed over the reins to Hu Jintao in the early 2000s. Between 2002 and 2005, he gave up all party posts. He remained a respected elder, but was last seen in public in 2019. Ill health has been the official reason for his absence since then. His funeral will be attended by both Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping. No foreign leaders have been called to see off the leader, who opened China to the world. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Like we told you, Jiang Zemin presided over China's economic boom. The sitting president of China is doing just the opposite. Xi Jinping is hammering the Chinese economy with his zero-COVID policies and his predatory practices vis-a-vis business leaders. Earlier today, a report said Jack Ma is hiding out in Japan. Now, most of you have heard about Jack Ma. He is the co-founder of the Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba. Not so long ago, Jack Ma was China's richest man. He was also the country's poster boy. This was before Xi Jinping decided to go after Ma. Stop his company's IPO and dictate how Jack Ma should run his business. Today, Jack Ma is reportedly living in Japan. He's been in Tokyo for about 6 months. This isn't a leisure trip, more like an exile of sorts. Reports say that Jack Ma has been going to Japan's hot springs with his family, also frequenting the ski resorts and making regular trips to the United States and Israel. But why is Jack Ma not visiting his home country? He has a home in Hangzhou. It is a city near Shanghai where Alibaba is headquartered. Instead, he is living in Japan. Has it got anything to do with China's travel restrictions? Or is there more? You see, it's a long story. We will start by telling you a little bit about Jack Ma. In China, he's bigger than life. Jack Ma has a career in films. He made an acting debut in 2017 by playing an invincible kung fu fighter. Jack Ma has sung on stage, danced in front of huge crowds. He writes kung fu fiction, practices Tai Chi, teams up with Jet Li. Jack Ma also plays poker. He paints. His works are auctioned at Sotheby's. Jack Ma has his employees do headstands and handstands at work. He was on the board of SoftBank. He is on the board of the Nature Conservancy too. He speaks fluent English. In short, Jack Ma is a superhero in China. They call him Daddy Ma. Outside the country, he is China's poster boy. Jack Ma was the first prominent Chinese man whom Trump met after he won the US presidential election in 2016. How do you think Xi Jinping views all of this? The Chinese president likes to be the be-all and end-all of China. A personality as towering as Jack Ma's threatens that. It becomes all the more dangerous when the people's favorite entrepreneur begins to question Xi Jinping's policies. And that's exactly what happened in Shanghai in 2020 when Jack Ma questioned Xi's policies, his regulations. Jack Ma earlier said, and I quote, "Great innovation won't back down because of regulations, but it shouldn't be regulated with yesterday's means." And this is when Xi Jinping decided to go after Jack Ma. The Chinese mouthpiece People's Daily issued a headline that read, "There is no so-called Jack Ma era, only Jack Ma in the era." The same article went on to explain, and I quote, "A good seedling can grow into a towering tree only when it meets the suitable soil and climatic conditions." And soon, Jack Ma went missing. He wasn't seen for months following that statement in Shanghai. In February last year, China blocked the IPO of Jack Ma's company. It was supposed to be the world's biggest IPO, worth more than $35 billion. The company we're talking about is called the Ant Group. Had the IPO gone ahead, it would have become the world's most valuable company. Imagine that. It would have put China on the map. But Xi Jinping didn't care. He instead decided to hammer the IPO, killed it at the very last minute. Any guesses why? Because Xi felt threatened, not just by Jack Ma, but his businesses. You see, the Ant Group is a financial services company. It began as a mobile payment service called Alipay. It then expanded its services, entered the microloans business, gave out loans worth millions, benefited over 1 billion people. The group then entered the investment business. It became like a bank that millions could carry in their pockets. The company became all too powerful, so the government decided to hammer it. And in the process, he also hammered China's economy. I'll explain. Xi Jinping wanted to make China a global superpower through technology. Jack Ma was supposed to be his foot soldier in that plan. An entrepreneur who understood technology, who could appear alongside top Chinese leaders and at the same time connect with a global audience. Jack Ma was doing all of that and doing it too well, it seems. Just that his growing popularity was too much for Xi to absorb. He decided to go after the very face of China's success story, and this is just one example of China's assault on business leaders. You see, decades of growth following Tiananmen had transformed China into the world's factory. Xi was entrusted with taking the Chinese economy to the next stage, make it a global leader. Technology was China's best bet, and China already had the lead there. But Xi Jinping chose to place hurdles on China's path. He tightened his control over internet giants. Apart from the Alibaba group, He also went after social media operator Tencent, again because the company looked all too powerful for Xi's liking. Alibaba and Tencent have been asked to invest in developing processor chips and other technologies that Xi considers as priorities. The president's approach has been heavy-handed and it is being seen as threatening innovation and economic growth. Then we have Xi's zero-COVID policy. It has been disastrous for global supply chains. Companies have had to look outside China. Apple, for example, had to move its iPad production to Vietnam. The factories that drove China's growth have now become hubs for protests. We have been telling you what's happening in China's iPhone city, where factory workers have been going on a rampage. The result? Apple is set to lose 6 million iPhone Pros, all because Xi Jinping has refused to live with COVID. What's more, economists are forecasting an annual growth of just 3% for China. This is well below previous estimates. In fact, according to one estimate, in 2021, China's economy valued at 114 trillion yuan, that's around $16 trillion. But this year, in 2022, it has apparently shed 3 trillion yuan. Only because of its zero-COVID policy. Because Xi Jinping just wouldn't open up China. See what I mean when I say Xi Jinping is doing just the opposite of Jiang Zemin. Instead of leading an economic boom, Xi Jinping is killing China's economy. Jiang opened China to the world. Xi is closing it. The question is, who will reform China from Xi's dictatorship? Now, we've said this in the past. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy is failing China miserably. Despite strict implementation, despite strict rules and regulation, China is only slipping deeper into its COVID nightmare. Look at these numbers now. On the 27th of November, China reported 38,500 cases. On the 28th, there were more than 39,000 new cases. And then on the 29th, China reported a colossal 71,000 new cases. After 2.5 years of this pandemic, the development of vaccines, better health services, and of course, China's very own zero-COVID structure, these numbers are embarrassing. Who's responsible for this? Who else but Xi Jinping? It seems he's still living in 2020. He's still sticking to policies which most of the world has now discarded. The ongoing protests, the anger on the streets, the calls for Xi to step down, they're all proof that his policies have failed. Try telling that to the CCP, which despite all of this, despite all the drama at home, is still flexing its muscle and threatening its neighbors. Take the case of South Korea. On Wednesday, it witnessed an incursion. Warplanes from China and Russia entered the country's air defense zone, but did not violate the country's airspace. We'll tell you the fallout in a bit. First, let's get some facts clear. How is a country's air defense zone different from its airspace? To start with, an air defense zone is an area wider than the country's airspace. It is used to identify and locate the aircraft about to enter the airspace, and it is usually declared unilaterally. So Russia and China violated South Korea's air defense zone, and according to reports, there were at least 6 Russian and 2 Chinese warplanes that entered the area without any notice. We understand Russia's intentions. It is waging a war in Ukraine. South Korea is a US ally. It is leading the efforts to end the same. So for Russia, this could have been simply a routine display of strength. But what was in it for China? Doesn't it already have too much to deal with at home? What was the need to try and threaten a neighbor that barely speaks on China's affairs? It's beyond us. Just like this report, it has been released by the Pentagon. Look carefully what the headline states. China to possess 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. 1,500. The report further says that China is working round the clock to amplify its nuclear arsenal. It currently has 400 warheads. It's looking to more than triple this number in the next 13 years. The report adds that China launched more than 135 ballistic missiles in 2021. That's more than the rest of the world combined. It doesn't end there. The report also says that China wants to control Taiwan by 2027, even if that requires the use of force. So what does this all tell you? That China may be losing on zero COVID, but it's not really lagging when it comes to Taiwan or even its foreign policy interests. It is pursuing all its missions at the same pace, notwithstanding the turmoil unfolding domestically. Is there more than meets the eye here? Is this all part of a grand plan? Well, we can't help but think so, given how the Chinese are notorious for their long-term planning. So is zero COVID merely a distraction for China to pursue its military ambition? Is Beijing using zero COVID to strengthen its grip on its people so that questions are not asked when it invades Taiwan? These are all possibilities for now. There's no saying if they will remain so. And now let's take a look at other stories and shift our focus to the European Union, the torch-bearer of climate activism. Or should I say climate change hypocrisy? We've dwelled on this several times and now we have another reason to. Look at this report. It says that in the last 9 years, big polluting industries have been granted more than 100 billion euros in free carbon permits by the European Union. A carbon permit is basically a credit of sorts which can be purchased by companies to make up for their CO2 emissions. In other words, you pay money in the form of damages and get your CO2 emissions off the charts. Basically, a free pass to pollute and not be accountable. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The European Union is helping it thrive. I'm not saying this. Surveys are. They show how the EU is giving free allowances to the big polluters instead of letting them buy it. I have some more figures for you. According to the Worldwide Fund, between 2013 and 2021, the EU gave free pollution permits worth 95 billion euros to energy-intensive sectors, namely steel, cement, chemicals, and aviation. What's worse, these permits didn't come with any climate conditions attached, like increasing energy efficiency or switching to renewables. The polluters face no such obligations. Now look at this graph. It tells you how many carbon permits the EU has sold and how many free carbon permits it has granted. The difference between the two is stark and wide. Since 2019, the EU has granted way too many free carbon permits than the number of carbon permits bought by industries. It doesn't end there. The EU has an emissions trading scheme, ETS. It's basically a scheme to charge polluters for CO2 emissions from coal and gas stations. The EU calls it a cornerstone of its policy to combat climate change. But is it really? The report says a third of the revenue raised from the ETS was never spent on climate action plans. So where then did the money go? To the EU's coffers. According to the report, between 2013 and 2021, more than 25 billion euros in ETS revenue went straight into the coffers of EU nations. 25 billion euros. That's not all. Another 12 billion euros raised in ETS revenue was spent on setting up new fossil fuel infrastructure. Where exactly was this new infrastructure set up? In countries like Germany, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Croatia. They all received climate change revenue only to set up more climate-threatening projects. These are some explosive revelations, but they're hardly surprising. Since time immemorial, the EU has put up a facade of trying to protect the environment, only to violate its own climate pledges. Let me give you some examples now. I'll start with this report. It came out in 2021. It said Europe's 25 biggest banks provided $55 billion. Take a look. Europe's 25 biggest banks provided $55 billion to new oil and gas projects in 2021. And the biggest European provider of fossil finance was HSBC, which is only one of the biggest banks in all of Europe. It apparently pumped out $8.7 billion into oil and gas expansion. The money went to companies like ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco. This happened last year, the same year when EU leaders pledged to improve their emissions at COP26. Do you know what became of those pledges? They all ended up stuck in red tape and ignorance. According to one report, more than 200 countries and regions agreed to cut emissions at COP26. A year on, only 24 countries have done so. And no, they're not from Europe. Most of these countries are from Asia. This is hypocrisy at its finest, especially if you look at Europe's history. Since the 18th century onwards, Europe burnt coal and other fossil fuel to develop its economy and get richer. It emitted a lot of greenhouse gases in the process. Over the decades, these gases changed our climate. The rest of the world started using the fuels too. Climate change became bigger, life-threatening. Now the world needs to clean up, but the responsibility for the cleanup is not being evenly shared. The blame is largely being put on the developing world, as Western countries, which are historically, morally, politically, and perhaps even financially responsible for climate change, now paint themselves as green. My point is simple. Industrialized nations grew at the ecological expense of developing countries. They became rich and very smartly deindustrialized later and exported their carbon emissions. Now they preach the world on cutting emissions, but can't even stick to their own pledges. Just think about that. Meanwhile, there's a climate crisis endangering the planet. There's no doubt about this. When we talk about climate change, there's always a villain in the story. Sometimes it's the government, sometimes organizations, sometimes companies. So who should be responsible for protecting the planet? Whatever your suggestion, I'm sure it will not be billionaires. But they are the ones who will take charge of a pristine island chain in Indonesia. And for what? A holiday spot? An exclusive vacation home, perhaps? Take a look.
When you think of the ultra-rich, what comes to your mind? Fast cars, luxury yachts, private jets. All of these are signs of opulence. None of them are eco-friendly. So, what would you say if a billionaire claims to want to protect the environment? Would you really believe it? Would you trust them to care more about nature than their bank accounts? Would you ever sell them one of the world's most fragile ecosystems? Indonesia plans to, despite the obvious dangers. Look at this statement. Every billionaire can own a private island, but only one can own this exclusive opportunity spread across 100+ islands. This was the sales pitch by Charlie Smith of Sotheby's Concierge Auctions. Sotheby's will be auctioning a group of islands known as the Weedy Reserve. Before we tell you more, let's take a look at some private islands. You know, the ones owned by your ordinary run-of-the-mill rich people. This is a Blacador Cay in Belize. It is owned by Leonardo DiCaprio. The Oscar-winning actor is known for his climate activism. He has built an eco-resort on his private island. Then there's Necker Island. It is part of the British Virgin Islands. It is owned by Virgin Group founder Richard Branson. He made a resort on the island too. It costs about $100,000 a day to rent. Can accommodate about 40 people, and about 100 people are employed as staff. The island was uninhabited when Branson bought it in 1978. Johnny Depp, Eddie Murphy, Mel Gibson all own private islands. So did financier and child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. His island, Little St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands, earned uncharitable nicknames, like the Island of Sin or Pedophile Island. Private islands are coveted status symbols, which is why the Sotheby's representative's statement should send alarm bells ringing. Why do we say that? Well, exclusive opportunity should not be how delicate ecosystems are described. Now let's look at the Weedy Reserve. It is made up of more than 100 uninhabited islands. It is located within a marine protected area, home to one of the most intact coral ecosystems left on Earth. Untouched rainforests, untainted mangroves, turquoise lakes, white sands. Hundreds of rare and endangered species call this atoll home. Take a long look at this ecological marvel before it's auctioned off on December 8th. Indonesia says it has a plan. The islands will still be subject to wildlife regulations after the auction. All development on the islands will be eco-friendly. That's their plan. Let's explore what will be permitted. Up to 500 1- to 8-bedroom villas. The minimum commitment is 50 luxury eco-resorts. Besides resorts, private island estates will be permitted. This is on just 17 of the islands. Up to 25 islands can be developed. Permission could be granted to build over 8 internal lagoons. A 1-kilometer-long private airstrip is also in the development plans. This, by the way, is considered sustainable. Sotheby's says the atoll will be reachable by, and we quote, a chartered Cessna, seaplane or helicopter. At this stage, we have to ask, in what way is this sustainable development? These are uninhabited islands. Private jets will obviously pollute the place, and the sounds they make will disturb the animals. Has no one told Indonesia that thousands of humans anywhere is bad for nature? How on earth is it okay for them to sell off fragile ecosystems to the highest bidder? Indonesia can say that the bidders won't own the islands directly, that they're buying a part of the development firm. But how does that help? The ultra-rich will be given a free pass to wreck paradise and build something that only other super-rich people can enjoy. We have a simple point. There has to be a better way to treat nature than giving it to the person with the biggest wallet and ego. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Our next story is from Iran. And it's unlike anything you've heard before. Iranians are celebrating their World Cup loss. Yes, you heard that right. The people of Iran are rejoicing over their team's defeat in the FIFA World Cup. On Tuesday, the United States beat Iran 1-0 and advanced to the knockouts. One would expect Iranians to mourn the loss, but no, that wasn't the case. Let me now show you a video. It's from the capital, Tehran. On Tuesday night, people in Tehran's Chitgar district were heard cheering and whistling right after their team was defeated. Watch this. Another video shows a busy street in Tehran where commuters are honking their horns as a group of Iranian protesters chant on the side of the street. Then you have this video. It's from an undisclosed location. It shows a group of Iranians dancing on the streets, celebrating the victory of the American side. And take a look at this video. It shows an Iranian citizen waving the American flag, chanting, "America, we are behind you." When was the last time you saw citizens of a country celebrating their own team's loss? I can't recall any instance. This is truly unheard of. The question is, what explains this? Why are Iranians celebrating their loss? Because they see it as the regime's loss. You see, most Iranians agreed that their team represents the regime, not the people. the same regime that they're now challenging. Remember, the people of Iran have been protesting for more than 3 months now. They're trying to build pressure on their rulers to change their ways, to let go of its draconian policies, especially on women's rights. The protests even reached the Qatar World Cup. Throughout the last 2 weeks, Iranians have used the World Cup as a platform to make their concerns heard. Iran has tried its best to censor them. Even the football team is said to have been threatened to not indulge the protesters and further their cause. So when the same team loses, the protesters try to portray it as a matter of national shame and try to embarrass the regime. It's as simple as that. In fact, even before the match started, Iranians weren't really looking forward to their team winning. Listen in.
Very important for me. Everybody should know about this. We don't have a voice in Iran. People in Iran don't have access to internet anymore. They need us to spread the message. We need you to spread the message, please. We really need you. Be our voice. Zan Zendegi Azadi.
This movement, we want to call it revolution. It's not a protest anymore. We want regime change in Iran. You know, it's been for more than 43 years that women just suppressed, but enough is enough. Our young kids, brave kids in Iran are just being killed, being shot because of the very basic rights they want.
I have mixed feeling. I can't say I'm happy really because my country is playing and I'm not really so keen that they win. As I know, this is just platform for government to use it to show everything is normal, nothing is going on in Iran. Right now there is martial law in Kurdish cities, and at the same time killing women and children, but at the same time using this platform of football just to show normality and nothing going on and show everything happy, everybody supporting the team. But to be honest, we don't really support the team because they don't represent national team, they represent national government's interest.
So how is the regime responding to this act of defiance with its usual authoritarian approach? Look at this headline. On the same day when Iran lost, the Iranian judiciary named 15 people who could face the death penalty. The figure includes 3 teens. All 3 are just 17 years of age. That's not all. Iranian authorities have also arrested 2 actors for standing in solidarity with the movement. It's not clear where the 2 are being held, but their families fear that their lives could be in danger. These were detentions. If we speak of the death toll, more than 448 Iranians have been killed by security forces since September. 60 of these fatalities were minors under 18, 9 of them were underage girls, and another 29 victims were women. These were the estimates according to Human Rights Group. By all means, the real figure is much higher. So at the end of the day, no matter how fierce the protests have become, no matter how much support they're getting, the Iranian regime is in no mood for a rethink. The message it's trying to send is loud and clear. Anybody who tries to disrupt the status quo, anyone who tries to question the regime's ways, will either be put behind bars or worse, executed. Let's move on now and talk about Alzheimer's. It's a dreaded word in families. It affects some 30 million people worldwide. And up until now, it was looked at with a sense of helplessness in medical circles. But the world woke up to some big news today. A study finds that one drug can slow the cognitive decline in Alzheimer's patients. It is being celebrated as a new era in Alzheimer's treatment. Now, that's a big claim. It is being hailed as a momentous medical breakthrough. And before I tell you what the study has found and why it should matter to you and me, let me tell you a little bit about Alzheimer's. What is Alzheimer's? It is a type of dementia. It affects your memory, your thinking, your behavior. If you are living with someone diagnosed with this illness, you can relate. It's heartbreaking watching your loved one fade away. Their cognitive abilities decline. The memory loss worsens over time, and eventually, patients are unable to hold a conversation. While Alzheimer's is not a normal part of aging, the greatest known risk factor in the illness is increasing age. It affects people 65 and older mostly. In some cases, if it affects a person younger than 65, it is referred to as early onset Alzheimer's. And sadly, there is no cure for this illness yet, despite the fact that it affects 30 million people worldwide, which is what makes this new drug so crucial. That brings me back to this study and the drug in question. It's called lecanemab. So how does the drug work? You see, there's something known as the amyloid protein. It collects around the brain neurons in Alzheimer's patients. The drug sticks to this protein and breaks it down, thereby slowing down the cognitive decline in patients. The trial involved 1,795 volunteers with early-stage Alzheimer's. They were given the drug every fortnight. The results make it clear that there is no miracle cure here, but the biggest breakthrough is that the decline in brain power slowed down by around a quarter. And this was over the course of 18 months of treatment. Let me tell you why this is a medical milestone. It gives millions hope that while there is still no cure, perhaps Alzheimer's could be treatable. The findings are being labeled as modest but significant. If you have a family member living with Alzheimer's, you would know about the challenges, the medical costs, the sense of helplessness and despair. So is this drug going to change all that? Let me be frank. It's expensive, between 10,000 and 30,000 pounds per patient a year. And it's not promising any miracle cure. So we will have to see if it will be easily adopted by patients. Let's talk about the side effects now. The safety of this drug has been called into question, especially after 2 deaths on the trial were linked to the drug by some researchers. So that poses another challenge for acceptance of this drug. If there is no miracle cure, will patients be willing to try it out? Next question, when will this drug be available? It is still unclear. There are several hurdles in its way. They need to get the approvals in the United Kingdom, and doctors say that the NHS or the National Health Service is nowhere near ready to deliver this new drug. The drug also needs to be cost effective. But here's a bigger question. Will the drug significantly slow down memory loss? Will it make any real difference to Alzheimer's patients? There's no correct way of answering this, because if you have a loved one living with the disease, you know how difficult it is to watch them forget names, addresses, memories, and eventually they become a shadow of their former selves. So if that can be delayed even by a quarter, it is indeed a breakthrough. And with that, it's a wrap on Gravitas tonight. Thanks for watching with me, Priyanka Sharma, leaving you as always with Gravitas Images.